Good evening to all that has joined tonight's session. You will just see a picture of me. My technology is not allowing my camera to be on, but there is actually a live person behind the presentation, and I'm Professor Jeanette Moritz, and I will be journeying with you this evening as we look at the development and presentation of your doctoral thesis. Meaning that we are traveling the journey to understand your chapter development and the chapter requirements for your doctoral thesis. So please get ready, and we will also have a question and answer session after the presentation. So jot down the questions that you might have and put them in the question and answer section, and we will go through them after the presentation. All right, so for tonight, as I've said, a warm welcome to everyone. Just a brief overview in terms of what we're going to do. So today's presentation is essentially a guide tailored for aspiring scholars, academics, and anyone embarking on a monumental journey of completing a doctoral thesis. So as you enter the challenging but rewarding realm of advanced academic research, understanding the intricacies of chapter development becomes very crucial. So this presentation is designed to demystify the process, breaking down each chapter's structure, content, and nuanced requirements. So there's just a few terms and terminologies. I often preempt or have had questions in the past. So I just wanted to clarify some commonalities in terms of questions that's often asked. And the first would be, what is the difference between a thesis versus a dissertation? So a master's, we have a master's dissertation and a doctoral thesis. So the difference between the two is that a doctoral thesis has greater breadth, depth, and intention than a master's dissertation, since it's based on original research. So that original research means that there is an original contribution to the body of knowledge, where with a master's dissertation, you only need to demonstrate that you can follow the research process, where in a thesis, you need to demonstrate that you are adding to the body of knowledge in some way. So while the standard length of a master's dissertation is around 100 pages or 50,000 words, a doctoral thesis can be upwards from 250 to 500 pages or around 80,000 words. So you can clearly see that the breadth is more, but it's not just doing more in terms of, say, for instance, in your master's dissertation, you might have had a population or a sample of 50, and now you do the same research, but now you have 100 people. That's not about the breadth. It is that your scope is larger and that you are going into more depth than what you did in a master's dissertation. And then definitely in a thesis, it is about your unique contribution. So that distinguishes what you are busy with now with what you might have been busy with in your master's dissertation. Now, the following is just questions that I've had before, and it's questions around what's the difference between a title versus a topic. So your title summarizes the main idea or ideas of your study. A good title contains the fewest possible words that adequately describe your content or purpose of your research, and it's usually not more than 15 words. Now, the reason for the 15 words being is that it's for indexing purposes. And so your title needs to be very succinct, but that it adequately describes the content and the purpose, or in a PhD, possibly the outcome or your unique contribution to your study. So in a master study, you might have had a title, the lived experience of postgraduate students doing a master's dissertation. And now a title in a doctoral thesis, if it now foreshadows your contribution, could be strategies towards supporting postgraduate students, or a framework to support postgraduate students. So often then your title would foreground what is your unique contribution that your thesis is contributing to. Whereas your topic is your broad research interest of the phenomenon under study. So the title is a succinct summary of your study, where a topic is your broader research interest. So just remember that your title, until the day that you pass your thesis, remains a working title. So you might be registering a title, but as things go along, you might revise that title, or at the end, even after examination, the examiner might suggest a title change. So your title up to the very end is a working title, but your topic remains set. So that's just a clarification. So when we talk about the structure of a thesis, there's a general or a generic structure that we're going to go through, but it also depends on your field. So usually a generic structure for a thesis will contain about 6 to 7 chapters, it could be more, which then includes your introduction and your conclusion chapter. If we are using a generic outline, it might look something like this. You would have your chapter 1, and we'll discuss each in a bit more depth just now. This is just a generic overview. So you'll have a chapter 1, which introduces your topic and gives the reader, which in this case will be your examiner, a brief overview of what they can expect in this study. Your chapter 2, usually a literature review that surveys the relevant sources and discourses on your topic. Now, this could potentially be split into 2 chapters. I've heard people having 3 chapters for their literature review, then 1 for their theoretical frameworks, or more than 1 on different topics of their literature review. So that then might ultimately change the number of chapters that you have. So chapter 3 is usually your methodology chapter, where you discuss your design and methods. Then chapter 4 gives the overview of your results or findings of your research. And chapter 5 gives a discussion of the results and their implications. Now, a master's dissertation would end here. They'll also still have a conclusion chapter, but this is more or less, you would have gone through the same process up to here with a master's dissertation. Now, with a doctoral thesis, you are now at a point that you need to do something with these results. And in that lies your unique contribution. And we'll talk about the different kinds of unique contributions in a while when we get to that chapter. But this is essentially your thesis culmination. This is the it that you are contributing to the body of knowledge. So for a doctoral thesis, this is a very, very important chapter. And then within, similar to your master's, you'll then have a last chapter, that's your conclusion, and shows your research contribution and how you have culminated. And this links closely to what you promised in chapter 1. So when I examine a thesis, I often first read chapter 1 and I then read chapter 7 to see if you have actually answered your research questions and if you have culminated in what you promised that you will do in chapter 1. So these two chapters hold hands. They become nearly like the bookends with the chapters in between where you are exploring in more depth. So let's have a overview in terms of each chapter and what might be needed as your chapters develop. So this is a generic outline, possibly also of your proposal. And your chapter 1 follows a similar process. So as in any chapter, you'll have your introduction. Now, the introduction to your chapter 1 might be a bit more tricky than the introductions to your other chapters, because you will have an introduction to the chapter, but also an introduction to your topic. So it is often a bit tricky to do both, but what I usually, because this introduction is so incredibly important, because your first words is what will hopefully catch your examiner's attention and will make them want to read with great anticipation the following chapters. So your introduction in this chapter is incredibly important, and your first sentence is very important. That first sentence needs to capture your audience, their attention. All right, so I usually say introduce your topic with a vibrant introduction, and then you can introduce the outline of the chapter following that. So potential headings could be the background of the problem. And you could also, if you wanted to integrate it into the introduction, so often you get an introduction that includes also then the background of the problem. You would then have a statement of your problem, introduce the purpose of your study. It could then be followed by your objectives, or your research questions, or could be hypotheses. Then generally we try and have our definition of terms early already in chapter 1, so that the reader knows what we mean by each of the concepts. Now your definition of terms at the very minimum needs to include every terminology or any concept that you used in your title. So you need to explain to your reader what these terminologies or concepts that you are using mean, so that they have a roadmap for the rest of your chapters. So you can present it in different ways. You can also incorporate these definitions in your introduction already if you wanted to, or sometimes we have it under a heading called the definition of terms. Then you would give a brief overview of your research design or your research methodology. Now, a research methodology refers to your research design and methods, or you can have separate headings, a research design and research methods, which will then be your methodology. But what is very important in chapter 1 is that you only give a brief overview. You don't go into the design in depth. You will be doing that in your chapter 3 when you discuss your design in depth. So here you are only giving the overview to the reader so that they can know what to expect, because this chapter is an overview of your thesis. The same would go for your research methods. It's an overview only, and you might consider where you want to have your ethical considerations, if you want it here, or if it's better suited in your chapter on your methodology. The reason why I say you can choose where you want to situate it is that ultimately we are trying to get chapters of more or less equal length So sometimes the research methodology chapter becomes so heavy that we might want to see if we can move some of the content to another chapter where it might still be relevant. So please remember, your design and methods are merely an overview. You'll discuss it in depth in chapter 3. Then, very important for your chapter 1, you would need to tell the reader what is the significance or your contribution of the study. So why is your study important? Why is it noteworthy? And for a thesis, then, what is the potential contribution of the study? So this will often mirror then what you had in your title. If your title said a framework for, then your contribution would be a framework for. So these aspects often hold hands with your title as well. Then you could have a heading that's assumptions and delimitations, or a similar heading would be the scope of the research. So it's very important to remember that delimitation isn't the same as a limitation. You only write about your limitations at the end of the study. Your delimitation simply means the scope of your study. So what does it include? What does it exclude? Is there a specific time frame? Is there a specific context, for instance? And those would be your scope or your delimitations. Your assumptions might go along with your paradigm, and your paradigm might have specific assumptions. Now, you can discuss your paradigm in your chapter 1 if you wanted to, or you can discuss it in your methodology chapter as part of that chapter. So again, you can decide where would be the best placed. And then obviously we'll have a summary. Now, if you've been to any of my other sessions, you'll know I have a thing about a summary and a conclusion. In these chapters, you will have a summary. It's not a conclusion. You can only reach a conclusion when you have argued something and provided evidence for to reach a conclusion. And we'll speak about conclusions a bit later. But for this chapter, you will end with a summary of the chapter, and you will give a hint to your reader what they can possibly expect in the next chapter. So your next chapter then is usually your literature review chapter. If you are doing, for instance, a qualitative grounded theory study, you might not have a literature review chapter, because the assumption of a grounded theory is that there currently isn't any theory. And therefore, you are working from the ground up to develop a grounded theory. But in most cases, for most studies, you will have a literature review chapter where you assess what is currently being said about your topic, the current discourses, the research that has been done within the field. And in this chapter, you are developing an argument to say what has been done, what hasn't been done, identifying the gap where your research is then located. And in this chapter, indeed, you can reach a conclusion because your discussion related to the research already being done and the gaps are based on evidence. So just a few hints and a bit more depth when I speak about a search description. So after your introduction of your chapter, you would need to tell the examiner how did you find the literature, and what is the methodology that you use to go about doing your literature review. So as any other part of your research, there is also a methodology to your literature review. And the first part would be to highlight your search description. Now, what I mean by a search description is I'm giving you an example of a study of early career health science professionals becoming postgraduate supervisors. So as with your aim of your study, the literature review might also have an aim. So here's an example. The literature review aims to explore the existing body of knowledge concerning the transitional challenges that early career health science professionals face when moving into the role of a postgraduate supervisor. It seeks to understand the mental, emotional, and professional factors influencing this transformation and the impact on their habitus and a professional identity formation. Now, the term habitus might give you a clue already that the study uses Bourdieu's concepts. So it's the framework is within Bourdieu's philosophical and methodological projects. Now, for this study, for example, I had the research strategy where I referred to which databases did I use. So I used PubMed, I used PsycInfo, Scopus, ERIC, and Google Scholar. And you might have different databases where you started your study from. Now, please, Google is a database, but it's not a scholarly database necessarily. You can start your search from Google, but you would need to follow it up with a more rigorous database in terms of where you search for information. Someone has asked previously, is ResearchGate a database? It is not a database, it's a repository. So yes, you might find relevant literature on that, but it doesn't, it's not a database or a search engine per se. It's more of a repository. But Google Scholar certainly is a search engine that will bring up scholarly articles that you could possibly then consider. So you would then also tell the reader which keywords and phrases you used in your search. So in this instance, early career health professionals or postgraduate supervision, or early career health professionals plus transitional challenges. So you will be very specific which keywords you used, and then possibly also the results that you had in terms of your keywords and phrases that you searched from. You will indicate a time frame. You used articles, books, and conference papers published, for instance, from 2000 to 2023. This is a very wide scope. I would actually, I don't like the 2000. It would probably be from 2018 to 23. We usually work within a 5-year time frame. And just remember, it's good practice to really try and get the most recent sources, remembering that your PhD will take 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 years to complete. So the danger of having, for instance, 2015 sources means that they will be very dated by the time you complete your thesis. So, and this goes for your references in your methodology as well. Please try and get the latest research books, the latest references, even for your methodology. All right, so in some fields, it becomes outdated within a year or within 3 years. So there's a very fast changes within certain fields. So please keep that in consideration when you are looking for your literature. Now, it might be that there's a classical source that you want to include. to, for instance, provide a historical overview. And that's fine. Then just tell the reader this is a classic source of 1969, and you've included it for this or that reason. So it's not saying that you cannot use classic sources. And then you will have inclusion and exclusion criteria for your search. So you might say you specifically, in this case, looked at works that addressed power dynamics language or other arrangements in postgraduate supervision, or you specifically look for studies in higher education. Mostly we have our exclusion criteria would be non-English language. So that would mean that in your inclusion criteria, you only looked at English sources and material. So you in your methodology, you will have very specific inclusion and exclusion criteria. So it might be that it's only English language, it's only between the following years, and you would then need to think what would be your specific inclusion and exclusion criteria. And now that's usually then part of your introduction in terms of situating and telling the reader what methodology you went about to get your sources. And this is a very important aspect that's often lacking in literature reviews, is the method that you went about in sourcing the material in your literature review. So you might also say, you know, that your analytical framework or your literature framework provides a review. It will synthesize the literature to define, for instance, context and contextualize certain spaces. In this case, a thematic analysis was used to identify themes that came up in the literature, and you might organize your chapter then according to these themes. It might also then assess the methodologies and outcomes and contributions of the selected words to emphasize the gaps and future research directions. So in your literature search, you might have discovered that most of the sources are quantitative in nature. And if you then wanted to go the qualitative route, you now have evidence to substantiate why you say that you are following a qualitative route. Or there might be very few quantitative studies and an over-reliance on qualitative findings, and you might then decide, okay, well, you're doing a mixed methods for your study, or whatever the case may be. But so your literature search might then be helpful, as well as justifying what search design you're using based on your literature search. And then you will also provide the reader with the expected outcome. So in this case, the literature review is expected to provide a comprehensive understanding of the complex transitional spaces of early career health science professionals in becoming postgraduate supervisors. So you can devise an expected outcome statement in terms of your literature review. So just go back. People often ask me, what is the structure of a literature review chapter? So that let's just go back in terms of the structure. And you can then, after your introduction and your search description, and your conceptual or your theoretical framework, which might be in the beginning or after you've done analyzed your sources, you would give a review of your research, and this can be organized in different ways. You can either organize it maybe historically, you can organize it by variables, you can organize it by themes. So it depends on your study, how you would like to present the review of your literature, and what makes logical sense in your study. And then, as I previously said, this chapter specifically has a conclusion, because you have argued and provided evidence in order to come to a conclusion. So in this chapter, having a conclusion would be very, very important, because you will now situate your study and in the broader context of what work has already been done. So your literature review in a PhD, you might also want to consider doing a specialized type of a literature review, for instance, a scoping review, or a review where you synthesize, or there's a number of very specific types of literature reviews. Now, if you follow, and each of those will have their own methodology. Now, if you've done a specialized type of a literature review, to get that chapter published is one of your first publication outcomes, potentially even long before you have findings. So if you do this chapter well, this could be your first publication. So rather err on the side of a very rigorous and search and reporting on that, to possibly give you the chance of publishing this chapter already while you are busy with your larger study. Remember now that the conditions for getting your PhD is that you must have submitted 2 articles to a journal before you can graduate. So it's not just working on an article or a draft, they must have been actually submitted to 2 journals. So if you can finish this off early in your PhD, then it will definitely help you towards the end. So don't wait too long before you start publishing, and definitely don't wait until the end of your PhD to conceptualize and work on publishable aspects of your PhD. All right, so we're fast forwarding on what we've spoken about for your literature review. And now we are at your research methodology chapter, which, if you only had 1 chapter on your literature review, will now be chapter 3. So you'll see within this chapter, I've given a lot of hints. So with all of the chapters, you'll have an introduction to the chapter. You will then start discussing your research design, whether it's quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, or anything in between those. You will then discuss or just bring in your questions and hypotheses again to orientate your reader. You will see that I've got something in there that says consider stages. And what I mean by that is, if you do a PhD, for example, and you have your first stage where you're doing, for instance, a situation analysis, then the second phase would be the operationalization of, say, developing a framework or developing, say, for instance, strategies. It might be easier to have this chapter in the different phases of your research. So with each phase, you can discuss the design, which questions it aims to answer, if there's maybe a certain population sample or sampling, and I'm thinking specifically of a mixed method study where you'll have a qual. So you can present it in stages. First, whichever stage is first, quantitative, qualitative, and write up all of these aspects and then go to the qualitative aspect of the design, and then discuss all of these stages. And then, just very important, in your mixed methods, you need to clearly discuss where's the integration of taking place. And so that might be an additional stage. So you might have a quant stage, a qual stage, an integration stage, and then you might have a stage where you are actually developing maybe your unique contribution. You would be developing a framework in that stage. So that would go along with another methodology, or you'll be developing strategies, and that will also have its own methodology. So I just find it useful to consider your execution of the research in stages. And then you can write up your methodology according to each of these stages, and make sure that each of the stage then have all the following aspects. So your population, sample and sampling, your instrumentation, if you've developed an instrument or interview guide, and then your data collection, your data analysis, then either your rigor or trustworthiness. And as I said before, if you needed to bring in the ethical considerations, you can place that in this chapter if you haven't discussed it before. Now, very important in this chapter differs from your mention to your methodology in chapter 1, because this chapter will now go into depth discussing your research design. Why did you choose this design? Amongst which designs did you choose, and why did you choose this design? So you need to justify every choice that you make in this chapter. Why did you choose this design? What are the advantages, possible limitations to this design, and how are you going to counter the limitations, for instance? So this chapter will definitely have a large theoretical component, but it also has a component of practical application. So very often students in this chapter rewrite the textbook. Now, the examiner knows the text, they know the theory, they're really not that much interested in the theoretical aspect. They want to know, how did you apply all this theory? How did you collect the data? Who collected the data? When was the data collected? By whom was it collected? Did you use field workers? What happened when you collected the data? Did you have any challenges? Did you need to make any adjustments? The same for your data analysis. It's an in-depth discussion, not just the theoretical, I will use this, that, and the following approach. Who analyzed the data? When was it analyzed? By whom? How did you go about checking, for instance, for rigor, and that there is a consensus about the inference that you make based on your data analysis. So in this chapter, it's not just about the theory. The same goes for your rigor and trustworthiness. There is a theoretical component where you will say, theory says this, that, and the following. But the examiner wants to know and see, how did you implement it? So, for instance, in trustworthiness, if you say you followed the criteria of, or the strategy of credibility, and one of the first ways of doing that is prolonged engagement. Now, the literature says that, but the examiner wants to see, what did you do to ensure prolonged engagement? For instance, if you did interviews, how long did you spend with the participants, building a relationship before the time? How long were the interviews? How long did you engage potentially afterwards? So although the theory is very, very important in this chapter, it's also very important in this chapter to put in the practical application. And this is one of the chapters, even when you have done this chapter, when you are reporting back, that you go back to this chapter and you can now kind of color it in. Because at this stage, you might be able to now, after you've done this, say, for instance, how many participants, for instance, did you have? You might have planned for 30, but something happened and now you have 20 or 40. Did you encounter any ethical problems? You'll need to report on that. So you might have a section that gives the theory on ethics, but you might have run into some challenges and you need to report on this. So this is one chapter that remains a living chapter until you complete your study. So please don't think that any of these chapters are set in stone. You will revisit them along your journey until the very, very end. So I call them living chapters, and this is one of the living chapters. In this chapter, I just wanted to mention something that I come across very often. And what students do is their internal logic is flawed. Now, what I mean by internal logic, we've got external and internal logics. The external logic is how your chapters flow, and that it makes sense and that it's congruent and flows logically. That's the external logic. But the internal logic refers to your headings, and the information under a heading needs to speak to that heading. And you might think that this is kind of taken for granted. I mean, why would you have a heading and then you don't discuss the relevant information under that heading? But I will tell you that in about 99% of thesis and dissertations and even proposals that I read, students will have the heading research design, and then under the design they discuss the data collection, for instance. Or under the data collection, they talk about the analysis. So please check for your internal coherence and check that the information under your heading speaks to that heading and not to something else. So if you've done your proposals and if you've done writing already, please go back and check for that logical internal congruence as well. Now, much as in your master's dissertation, you get to your the next chapter, and that would be your results and findings. So this chapter, as with any chapter, will have an introduction, and you will now report on your findings. You can decide how you want to organize this chapter. It can be organized according to your questions, your hypotheses, or the themes that emanated, for instance, from a qualitative study. And in this case, again, you can reach a conclusion because your findings is the evidence that will bring you to the place where you can reach a conclusion based on the evidence provided, and that is your findings. So this is very similar to what you already did in your master's dissertation. Now you can either have your discussion within this chapter, where you will have your findings and integrate the discussion, and that would be comparing and contrasting your findings or your results with previous research. It can be combined into this chapter, but I often find that in a thesis that this chapter is quite heavy. Just with the findings alone, and then we might have a separate chapter for our discussion. I'll talk about the unique contribution more in the next chapter. So if you are splitting your chapters and you have a chapter on the discussion of your findings or literature control in qualitative studies, And this is where you would now compare and contrast your findings with previous findings, and I literally mean compare and contrast. So not only looking for confirmation of your findings to say that I found this and 3 other studies also found this. You're also looking for what did other studies find that you didn't find, or vice versa. What did you potentially find, but there isn't any other research. So this is a very critical stage of your study, and it really requires critical and conceptual thinking when you compare and contrast. So please don't only look for studies that confirm. It's also studies that disconfirm or contrast with what you have found. But you would have done something similar in your master's dissertation. Now, the next chapter is your unique contribution chapter. So up to now, you more or less did what you did in your master's dissertation. What comes now is, what do you do with the findings? Because based on these findings, you are contributing your unique contribution. So it might be in the form of a model or strategies based on the findings, or guidelines, or develop a program, or develop frameworks. But this is typically your chapter where your unique contribution of your thesis is presented. I say it's the intellectual heart of your thesis. So it's not merely about adding new findings to the existing body of knowledge. It's about forging a distinct path, providing fresh insights, and challenging or expanding current understandings in your field. So this novel contribution sets your work apart, showcasing originality, creativity, and the ability to think critically and independently. Now, these words in red is the evaluation criteria for a PhD. So it's not just words that I made up. If you go and look at the NQF level 10, where you are now playing at, the descriptors there and the outcome descriptors, this is an outcome on a level 10, showcasing originality, creativity, and the ability to think critically and independently, and then make a novel or a new contribution. So in essence, this is what elevates a PhD thesis from a mere compilation of facts to a significant and transformative scholarly achievement. So a level 10 is the epitome of scholarly development in terms of qualifications. And this is what you need to demonstrate in your PhD. So a very, very important aspect, because this is what you're actually being evaluated on. So then you would reach your final chapter, which is usually a summary, implication, and outcomes. And remember, I said that this chapter will mirror chapter 1. So as all chapters, you'll have an introduction. You'll have a summary of your findings or your results, but please, very short and succinct. Don't rewrite everything. And then you have your conclusions based on each of your findings or of your results. So if you had different phases, you might have conclusions based on each. And again, you can organize your conclusions by questions, hypotheses, or themes. So yeah, you would have, so your conclusions will be based on your findings, and your recommendations will be based on your findings and your conclusions. Now, here is the place for your limitations. Now you can tell your reader what were the limitations of your study. Was it the scope? Was it the design potentially? Was it in your data collection? So I often really enjoy to see and to read this aspect of your research, because I don't believe that everything went well all the time. then I don't find your research believable. So please be honest in terms of the limitations. This is not what is going to make you fail. So often students say, oh, I don't want to say this and that because I might fail. This isn't what's going to get you failed. This is giving an honest account of what the limitations of your study is. And it often then provides information for people that might want to do a similar study, that they were aware of the limitations of this study and that they can maybe plan differently or go about it differently if they wanted to replicate something similar. Then definitely you will have suggestions or recommendations for future research. But it doesn't only need to be future research. You can have suggestions or recommendations for instance, policy, for education, for research, for practice. So don't only think that you need to give recommendations or suggestions for future research. And then very importantly, at the end, you will have a conclusion around your entire thesis. So this is the conclusion of all the conclusions that you have achieved. And this is a very, very important part to write. I know by this time of your studies, you are totally exhausted. And after you've written the earlier conclusions, you might be quite sick of writing conclusions. So please write your conclusions when you are nice and fresh, because this is the culmination, the final conclusion of the entire journey. And as I said, this would then mirror with your introductory chapter. This is where I'll now look at what you promised or said you're going to do and deliver versus did you deliver what you promised you were going to do. So this chapter holds hands with your chapter 1, and your conclusion very often mirrors your introduction to your first chapter. All right, so just as a way of maybe also helping you to think about your conclusion, and that this conclusion often mirrors your introduction of your chapter 1. All right, now we need to stitch together all these chapters into a complete thesis. So now we need to consider different aspects. For instance, the front, I call it the front matter, which deals with your title page, the declaration, your acknowledgements, your summary or your abstract, and your table of contents. So this is the bookmark of the front of your thesis. So just a quick overview of what the expectations are here. Your title page will look like the following. When you have given a notice of intent about 3 months before you hand in your study, they will send you this document, and that it will give you the outline. So I've just copied from the official document that you'll receive what your title page will look like, the official format of that. Then your declaration is, they will give you the declaration and it looks the following, so you can copy and paste it directly. And you promise here that your work is your own, that the original checking software is within the acceptable requirements, and you declare that this work hasn't previously been submitted for examination at UNISA or any other qualification at any other higher education institution. Now, this is a legal declaration, so in this instance, you have to physically sign this declaration, okay, because it's becomes a legal document. And then you will also receive information in terms of what is expected of your key terms. So UNISA expects that you will have 10 key terms. That's quite a lot, so think about them very, very well and in depth, because the key terms is about retrievability. So it also goes with the indexing, and this will make your study retrievable. So there's an example, for instance, the title of a thesis and then examples of key terms. But UNISA requires that you have 10 key terms, and you'll also find that in the document that they send to you. So UNISA requires a summary to a maximum of 350 words. So that's quite a succinct summary for a PhD. And often examiners will, say that you needed a more in-depth summary, but UNISA requires 350 words. The same reason it's for indexing purposes, the same reason that your title needs to be as succinct as possible. It's also for indexing purposes. So that's the requirement, and you'll also find that in your letter once you've provided your intention to submit. And then we come to the last bookmark, and that's your back matter. And that would be your references and your annexures. So usually our annexures could be things like your ethical clearance letters, non-disclosure agreements, interview guides or instruments, maybe a transcribed interview in a qualitative study, your editor's letters to say that you have the work was professionally edited. And you might now also add your Turnitin results, proof that you have put it through Turnitin, and then proof of what your similarity index is. Some departments put it in front, right before you or after your declarations and such. But I prefer to have it as an annexure at the end. But check with your supervisor what they do in your specific department, or how they want it and where they want it. Okay, so now we've dealt with the working chapters, we've dealt with the front matter, we've dealt with the back matter. So the rest of the slides is really just additional information. And I always say that your thesis structure is a form of an argument. So an argument typically has a statement, evidence, and a conclusion. So your thesis needs an argument that answers the research question, and each part of the thesis should contribute to your argument. So the thesis structure should support your argument, and an argument map can therefore be useful to guide you through your project. Now, argument map is simply a visual tool that represents the structure of your argument and help you to break down complex ideas into manageable parts. So you can have an argument map within each chapter as well. So it often consists of boxes or nodes representing statements with lines connecting them to significant logical relationships, such as support or contradictions. So you can see this argument map, if you draw one up for each chapter, it can then, and then really critically think how the argument is developing throughout your thesis. To reach also then a specific logical conclusion. So, for instance, and the ability to argue. If you've got this structure internalized, you can use it in so many ways. So you can have an argument for your thesis. You can also have arguments within the thesis chapters. So an argument, as I said, has a main claim. It then has evidence to support that. This is just an example. And then you might also have counter arguments. So remember, I said we also always look to compare and contrast. So always think of a counter argument. I'm busy writing a grant proposal, and I can already envision what counter arguments I'm going to have. So I'm trying already to put measures in place to deal with that counter arguments. But it's important, and this form of argumentation, if you internalize it, you can use this for your literature review, so that you look at arguments for and against whatever statements you are making, so that you get a well-rounded piece of argumentation throughout your thesis. So similar to what I say, you might also think of rebuttals, and in this way you can now make conclusions that really that are rigorous and that is based on a well-argumented thesis statement. All right, so that's just a bit of additional information. Remember, you're now on a PhD level. You are supposed to be able to argue and do it in this way. So some evaluation criteria that you can self-evaluate your chapters and your outline, beginning with your title. Does my title contain the key concepts developed in the thesis? Does this thesis chapters hang together? That means that they're logically coherent. Does my introduction guide the reader about my research structure or scope? Is there a sense of argument developing in my thesis? Do I guide my reader by making links between the different sections and subsections? And that doesn't only mean between chapters, but even your writing as you write within your chapter, that each section or each paragraph links to the previous paragraph and has, for instance, a transition sentence. So that's also in your writing style. And then do headings and subheadings encapsulate the meaning of the text that follows the headings and vice versa. So just on the writing aspects, people often say, oh, but English isn't my first language. My argument is that scientific language is nobody's first language. So it's not only about the English, it's about scientific writing. And we all need to develop that. And it's a process that continuously taking place. So very often we really, it's a lifelong process to write academically. So I've just given you small hints of books that could help you with academic writing. This is an oldish book, but I find it very nice. It's very concise, it's very user-friendly, and it is cheap. So on a PhD level, I always suggest that you buy yourself a good latest edition of a methodological book that's your own, that you buy yourself one or two key readings, for instance, or get your own collection of articles, and that you also invest in books with your development. So this book, Get Ready, Get Set, Go, preparing for your doctoral studies and doctoral education. Also not very expensive, but it would clearly guide you through the process of your doctoral study. So a very good reference for, you know, what I've spoken about now. It's easily, you can get it from Take a Lot, you can get it from any good book dealer, and it's not that pricey. So I really would suggest if you purchase anything, that it's one or two of these books or both, a good quality methodological book, so that you have the latest edition of that can stand you throughout your 5 or 6 or 7 years, hopefully not that long. All right, so these are just some tips for books that might help you through your journey. And then lastly, enjoy the journey. It's not just about the destination. So please enjoy the small celebrations. For instance, when your proposal is accepted, celebrate when your when you get ethical clearance, celebrate. When you've done your data collection, celebrate. Don't just wait until the very end, because that's a long wait to wait 5 or 7 years to pat yourself on the shoulder and acknowledge the wins that you've and the gains that you've made. So celebrate throughout the process and enjoy the journey. It can be very lonely. It can be very stressful. Please reach out to support systems. The university does have support systems. There's online links to support. There is a counselling service at UNISA that they offer. So please make use of it. It is a long journey, and life happens in that journey. So there's a lot that's being said of the mental health, especially of doctoral students. Lately, there's a lot of studies confirming that there's huge mental health challenges for doctoral studies. So please keep a tap on yourself, identify what stresses you, when it stresses you, and what you can do to also attend to that stresses, that it doesn't become a unmanageable thing and delays your progress. All right, so please take care of yourself during this journey. All right, so that brings me to the end of the discussion, and I'm now going over to the Q&A section. I just wanted to load on my side and to see what questions you had. I'm just going to try and move this. So yes, let's see what you had to comment on. Christo, good evening. Thank you for your time. Is a research design sort of similar to a structure? Not really. So your research designs is either a qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods. Those are your main designs in research. So not necessarily referring to your structure. It's referring to one of those types of designs. Your structure is the general layout. It might be your scope or the structure of a chapter or the thesis, but the design is something different. Your design is very specific, related to a research design, which is quant qual or a mixed method. I hope that answers you, Christo. Anonymous, does book chapter publications serve the same purpose as the article when publishing for a PhD? Yes, for sure. You can publish book chapters. Definitely, that would be seen as an output. And so yes, you could do that as well. It doesn't have to be an article. The output can be different. For instance, in the art, the outputs will look different. You might have in the arts have where you have a word where you actually have an exhibition. That might be an output in the arts. So the outputs might look different in different fields, but you could definitely, a book chapter would count. Themes, is it acceptable if an abstract is accepted for a special issue instead of the paper being published as part of a graduation? It's not just the abstract. No, definitely not. You would need to have a complete article. So it's not just that an abstract is accepted. The paper needs to be not accepted, but you need to have had a full paper that you had handed in, or a full paper that was submitted. The abstract on it, just the abstract won't suffice. Okay, so you might get conference proceedings where you need to submit the entire article. And based on that, you could say that it's published or presented and accepted in a conference proceeding, for instance, but not only the abstract. All right, needs to be more than that. Kedibone, for a mixed methodology, do I follow the same structure for qual approaches? Yes. You follow the same structure. Okay, either or, but the structure would be similar for both, or even if you when you combine it. So just remember, with a mixed method study, it's not a mixed methodology, it's a mixed method. You have your qualitative, you have your quantitative phases in whichever order. But what is critical in a mixed method study is that you have to have an integration phase. You have to, that's a hallmark of a mixed method study. It's not just that you have a quant and a qual study. The whole aim of a mixed method study is that there is a place where these two culminate and integrate, and that is the essence of a mixed method study and why you are doing it. So the qual findings might, once they are integrated, lead to the development of whatever your unique contribution is, but you have to have a phase where the two are integrated. So you can use that structure for your quant section, use the structure for your qual section, and then you have to discuss the integration phase, and that you can use your own structure. I hope that answers your question, Kidibone. Then just the next one, Prof, please advise me, should we consider qual, quant, and mixed methods as a research approach or a research design? Yes. Oh, this is such a unique aspect that comes up, and I know where the question lies in. It is very, very confusing for students and even academics already. The confusion lies in that different books refer to designs and approaches differently. So one book, say for instance, Cresswell, refers to a qualitative research design. And then if you choose, then you can choose a specific approach within the design. That might be phenomenology, case studies, grounded theory, narrative research. So Cresswell, and I usually follow his semantics, because that's all it is. It's semantics. I just, I stick with Cresswell, who refers to quant, qual, mixed methods as design, and then the approaches would be, what type of a qualitative study are you doing? What type of a quantitative study are you doing? What type of a mixed method study are you doing? But you can use either words. As I say, it's really just semantics. The big thing to remember, though, is that you use it consistently. If you decide to use research design, the word design, as quant, qual, or mixed methods, then use it consistently. Don't later then refer to a qualitative approach, where you mentioned a qualitative design earlier on. So get someone whose work you are following, decide for yourself, I'm going to refer to quant, qual designs, and then within those designs, the different approaches, or you can do it the other way around. Some authors refer to it in the other way around, but the key to this is decide which you want to do. Neither is wrong nor right, but the key is to use it consistently, whichever one it is that you then decide to use. Do I have to get an editor even my formatting and editing of a document as at require standard? Yes. Yes, you need to have your document professionally edited and professionally formatted. Some students are pretty good at this, and if you're one that's pretty good at formatting it professionally, then you could do it yourself, but I find very few students are able to do that. So, but it is a requirement from UNISA before you hand in that your thesis is professionally edited, and you need to provide evidence of that. And that usually is in your annexures. So yes, you have to. When we publish papers before we submit a final thesis, will this not cause problems on Turnitin plagiarism? You can then just justify it. So what I do if my students publish before handing in is that I tell the journal that this is part of a thesis or part of a dissertation. So what they do then is on the publishing side of the journal, they will then allow a similarity index of up to 50. And that means simply that you needed to change whatever you are submitting by 50%. So you can't just take your thesis as is and publish it as is. You need to, the scoping review you could, and you can always put disclaimers that you have already published this article, therefore the index factor for this chapter might be very high. But remember that even if you publish other parts of your thesis, you need to reconceptualize each part. With a doctoral thesis, it's very unlikely that you are able to publish your results as they are. It's simply too much. Article is usually around 5,000, max 7,000 words, and those chapters are often longer than that. Or you still need to, in the article, incorporate your introduction, and that needs to be adjusted according to what you are publishing in terms of your findings. So your article is reconceptualized based on either the call of the journal, the type of journal that you're going to publish in. So it's very seldom that you can publish exactly what you had in your doctoral thesis. But there are parameters, so you could definitely, you have to say when you publish an article from your thesis that you acknowledge that this is part of a thesis, and that way you can clear yourself in terms of that. And then when you hand in your thesis and there is a similarity that comes up, it will show in certain chapters, and you can just, have a report with your supervisor to say that this is the reason for the higher similarity. But it shouldn't be a problem. Remember, you need to rephrase, paraphrase, and reconceptualize your articles for journal submissions. So it really is very seldom that you're going to publish it exactly as it is. All right. So you would probably end up paraphrasing your own work in any event. If we divide the chapters and write them up as papers, and I want to publish the papers later, is this not a cause of problems? No. So there is a route. Well, you can do a PhD via publication, and then you'll have to have each chapter a published article. You just then have front and back ends, and that isn't plagiarism, but the same as what I answered now. The same would go in terms of what I answered the previous question as well. All right. Ganette, thank you so much. I'm a philosophy student. Oh, I love philosophy students. As you know, that philosophy research is different from other social sciences. Would you say something how chapters can be developed in this research? No, I can't. What I would suggest, Ganette, is that you go and look at previous theses that have been published in your field and in your department or in philosophy, the specific philosophy stream that you are following, and get an idea in terms of how those chapter looks. But the same kind of general guidelines would be, I mean, you'll still have a introduction, you'll still have a conclusion, but in a philosophical framework, you will be dealing with each chapter, possibly in terms of your philosophy, and as it develops and as your arguments develop in parts as that. So some chapters will still remain, but what I would suggest is that you have a look in your field or ask your supervisor for examples, or maybe go to the repository of the UNISA library, and it's an e-repository, and you might find some examples that you could possibly follow. So I'm sorry that I can't help anything more than that, but I have great respect for the philosophy students. In my other life, I would like to become one of those. So enjoy the process as well. Prof, when writing the literature review, do we need to first identify what type of approach of a literature review to be utilized? Yes, yeah. For example, systematic, narrative, or thematic literature review. Yeah. Remember, I said you need to in the beginning already say what's your aim of the study, your methodology. So this would come in with your methodology. You are doing a specific type of a review. You can then give some information section on for instance, systematic reviews. Which type of a systematic review will you follow? Systematic reviews also then have a specific format for reporting them, and that you could then use to publish as is. So yes, very important. You would say in the beginning what type of a literature you are doing, and what's the methodology and reporting structure for that specific type of a literature review. Indeed, you're on the right track. May a thesis using grounded theory still include a literature chapter, which is orientation to provide the background to the study, the lay of the land, and not related to the problem being investigated? Yes, indeed, it could. Yeah, so very much this literature will actually be very often situated in could be situated in your chapter 1, where you orientate the study and give the background and what has been done, or you might quite rightly say you can have it then as a different chapter where you are giving the lay of the land and the scope, and then also argue for why you are doing what you're doing. Indeed, on the right track. Interesting session, you're welcome. Yep, so there's been some very interesting questions. Are there any other that might come up for those of you that have maybe listened to some of the answers? Is there something that's maybe still unclear, or that you would like to go on further questions? Now is the time. So I thank you for very robust discussions, and thank you for your thank yous. So if there are any other questions that you would still like to pose, please do so now. Otherwise, we will be closing the session for tonight then. There we go. Okay, thank you, Anonymous, for saying that the information is clear. and for the presentation and the responses. You're very welcome. I hope that it demystifies the chapter developments in your thesis and that you've got maybe just a clearer picture of what's expected and how it goes. Okay, I see the attendees are starting to fall off. Any last questions? Again, thank you. So it seems as if the information was clear and that you don't have further questions. I then bid you a very good night and all the best with your studies. It's a long process, so please look after yourself and celebrate the small wins. With that, I'm going to leave you for tonight. Please take care, take well, and I say goodbye.